Adam Hoffman is our Senior Vice President of Learning Partnerships and Growth at ABA Technologies. Adam is an instructional designer who specializes in building learning and performance systems that improve professional practice. He plays a key role in developing corporate training programs and educational technologies, drawing on experience across private education settings and specialized healthcare environments. Adam's work focuses on bridging the gap between training and real-world performance. Joining Adam is Danielle LaFrance, who is our customer success manager, and she brings over 23 years of experience working with individuals with developmental disabilities and more than a decade of leadership experience in behavior analytics service organizations. Danielle has led clinical teams, developed scalable service delivery systems, and mentored dozens of future BCBAs through internship programs that she helped establish. Her professional interests include verbal behavior, so great topic for today, generative programming, discrimination, and staff training, and she is deeply committed to the science of behavior analysis. Danielle has contributed extensively to the field through research, publications, conference presentations, and editorial service, and she has been recognized with multiple awards for her clinical supervision and scholarly work. We're excited to have both of them here today, so let's get started.
Great. Well, thank you, Maddie, and welcome everybody to our May webinar, or our April webinar on verbal behavior. We've been going over the last several months talking about different topics of professional development for RBTs. Because we know that the PDU requirement from the BACB that started in January is on a lot of minds for people, for organizations. And there are a lot of ways that you can set up PDU opportunities for staff that are effective, and then other ones that meet the requirement but aren't so effective. And so we're trying to walk through some different content domains that we think are really important, that our clients express to us are important for them in making sure that people are delivering high quality care. And so if you've missed any of those previous webinars, I encourage you to go to our YouTube page. That's where you can find all of them. And we also usually send out a follow-up email, or we always send out a follow-up email, but it has a link to the webinar. And then we'll also include some resources in there that we mentioned during the session. I'm really excited because yesterday was our first day of the Clinical Leaders Community, which we've been talking about for a long time, but it is off and on its way. And it's been exciting to welcome members in over the last week or so and yesterday. But the Clinical Leaders Community is a space where you can, where people who are interested in becoming leaders in clinical organizations or are in leadership positions, whether it's training, operations, clinical, whether you're a trainer, whether you're a training director, whether you're a chief clinical officer, in any of those roles, it's a space dedicated to building community around the topics that most of you are concerned about, and many of the ones that we work on. So things like overseeing training, building supervision systems, improving employee performance, creating a cohesive client and employee experience. And so the space allows us to have conversation with one another about certain topics. And then every week we deliver some new piece of content, whether it's a podcast episode, whether it's a tool, whether it's a live workshop, whether it's an exclusive webinar or Ask Us Anything event. And these are available to the members of the community. And you can earn CEUs as well. It is $150 for the year, and you can earn up to at least 16 CEUs through a variety of the activities that are in there. This first month, we're focused on active student participation or active participation in training. Then we're going to dive into things like the onboarding experience, evaluation of training systems. We're going to get into things like clinical quality review committees, setting up a research review committee, those kinds of topics that are important to clinical leaders. So we hope you'll join us. We're really excited for the people that have already joined, but welcome others to join us as well. And the topic that we're talking about today, and we've been talking about for several weeks, relates to a product that we released last year called ProTech. And it's a professional development product for technicians advancing in their skills. And it's a series of short learning events that are all asynchronous that you can assign to team members. And then it gives you a companion workbook and supervision book so that you can take the topics that people are focused on in the online portion of the review, or maybe it's a new training for folks, and then they can practice it on the job. So here's a snapshot from our verbal behavior curriculum. We use some upfront review of the main topics, the foundational topics, which you should find in a 40-hour training, but ones that maybe technicians don't feel super strong on because they're getting thrown a lot when they come into that 40-hour training. So we review the basic operants, and then we get into teaching procedures related to each of those verbal operants. And then the workbook and the supervision manual connect to each of the topics. So you go through a little bit of learning on the tact and then teaching the tact. And now we're talking about your clients' programs that are focused on tacts. And we're going in and doing some structured observation. We're doing some role play during supervision meetings, those kinds of things. And so it's a whole system to get everyone on the same page about what the focus should be clinically, and to do that in a way that allows you to bring in new technicians into the program over time without always being dependent on delivering live instructor-led training. So today that takes us to verbal behavior. So Danielle's going to go over a recap on some of the things related to teaching verbal behavior and teaching skills related to verbal behavior. And then with whatever time we have remaining, I'm going to talk about some training strategies related to working with technicians and making this more palatable for them as they start to implement and continue to implement verbal behavior program with their learners. So I'll hand it over to Danielle.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Maddie and Adam, for the introductions. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I'm really excited about this month's topic because, as Maddie said, it's my favorite, and it's actually where the vast majority of my research has been focused and all my publications have come from. So, really excited to talk with you all about this today. But let's start by talking about some of the main takeaways that we might want to impart when training new technicians in verbal behavior. This is a complicated topic area, right? It's not easy at all. And the most obvious is, of course, how to teach the verbal operants. But I'm not going to start there because I would suggest that it's important for technicians to first understand what this thing we call verbal behavior actually is, as well as why we take a Skinnerian approach to teaching it. Now, this might sound like it's going to be very conceptually heavy, but it's not really, so stick with me. And we'll talk more about that. But this gives technicians a starting point with common language as well as a rationale, which can go a really long way in getting them on board with how we go about teaching these skills. And once technicians can discriminate verbal behavior from nonverbal behavior and they understand our approach, this is a foundation upon which we can then subsequently teach our technicians about the controlling variables for each operant. And then in turn, this becomes extremely important when teaching them to teach verbal behavior skills and then doing so with accuracy, because this is tough. So we'll dig into each in a bit more detail. Then I'll circle back around to these big ideas when we discuss considerations and common challenges. So we can put this into the perspective of how to plan for and train effectively for all these skills in a way that sticks. All right, so if you've attended our previous webinars this year, you may have noticed that we didn't really get into theory. So you might ask yourself why we're starting here. And the answer, I think, is pretty simple. Most of our new technicians do not have exposure to Skinner's analysis, and very, very few of them have taken behavior analytic coursework that has introduced them to verbal behavior. On top of that, our theoretical approach drives how we intervene on language deficits, and most, if not all, of our technicians are already familiar with competing theoretical approaches, think like popular psychology, right? That don't serve them well in teaching verbal behavior skills because these more common or traditional linguistic approaches are diametrically opposed to Skinner's analysis. It's kind of flipping things on their head when we think about language and communication in humans. So we need to establish a common language and framework for them to really understand this thing we talk about clinically as supervisors and these things that we expect them to teach. And if you look at this learner journey, you can see that this is how we set up our verbal behavior ProTech course. And we'll look at this in more detail later. So this is just an at a glance. So if you'll recall, the first bullet point I had listed on my earlier slide pointed to the importance of teaching technicians what verbal behavior is and what it isn't. So here, while we want to provide some definitions, we want to make learning as active as possible. And as Adam pointed out, that's really the topic or the focus area in the clinical community this month, right? Getting that active student responding, that active learning. And a great way to set this up is by doing some discrimination training. I've included another screenshot from our Verbal Behavior ProTech course here so you can get an idea of how we've done this. So after providing a layman definition, so this is in really digestible terms, we immediately begin teaching technicians about the critical features of verbal behavior. Each of these cards you see requires that the learner click on it to be flipped. And then once they do, more information is provided. So after they flip this first card, the response is learned. It states a speaker's verbal behavior is shaped by their environment, antecedents evoke it, and consequences reinforce it, sorry. When they flip the second card, the information they get states there must be another individual, the listener, who reinforces the speaker's verbal behavior. Reinforcement cannot be obtained independently. And when they flip the final card, it states the listener is part of a larger group who has been conditioned or trained to respond to the speaker's verbal behavior in a certain way. Then after this exercise, examples of verbal behavior are provided to help them apply the concepts. And immediately after those examples of verbal behavior, we begin training them to discriminate it from nonverbal behavior. So now they know what verbal behavior is, right? They've gotten some really basic language around it that's paired with some of our more technical terms. And then we're teaching them how to differentiate that from what nonverbal behavior is. Additionally, another important distinction to provide training on is the difference between vocal and non-vocal behavior and how this might also be interpreted as verbal behavior or not. And once those basics are taught, discrimination training should continue across all of these concepts. That is, having technicians identify instances of verbal behavior, non-verbal behavior, as well as vocal verbal and non-vocal verbal behavior. And ideally, this would also be embedded in real-world scenarios. And here's one example of a video from our ProTech course. So we'll just watch this together and then we'll move on.
Think, for example, of having dinner at a table with a large group of people. Maybe of your family during a major holiday. After taking one bite of your food, it tastes bland and you need to add salt to it.
Could you pass the salt, please?
Sure. Your request asking for salt is an example of verbal behavior. You communicated to another person by asking for something you needed. The reinforcement for your response was then mediated by that person. They complied with your request and provided you with the desired reinforcer, the salt. Let's go back to our dinner party scenario again, but this time you'll see it play out a little differently. Suppose that the salt is close enough for you to reach it yourself, and you don't need to request it from anyone. In this instance, the reinforcer for your response was not mediated by another person. You did not need to ask someone else in order to access the reinforcer, the salt. You could obtain it directly by reaching for and getting the salt yourself. This is not verbal behavior. Let's go back to the dinner party scenario one more time. Think about how you might request the salt if it was in front of someone else at the table, but they were too far away to hear you ask for it. Although you did not vocally ask for the salt this time, you still made the request for it to another person, but in a different way by pointing, which is an example of non-vocal verbal behavior. Your gesture was then mediated by that person. They complied with your request and provided you with the desired reinforcer.
All right, perfect. Thank you for playing that, Adam. So I think that's a really nice illustration of how you can embed all those concepts: verbal behavior, nonverbal behavior, vocal behavior, non-vocal behavior, and if it's verbal behavior or not, into one example that is probably a common scenario in our lives, right? It's very relatable. All right, now the third bullet point I had listed on my previous slide pointed to Skinner's analysis. While we don't want to go deep into theory and theoretical debates here, we should orient our technicians to this approach and why we take it. But again, we want to make learning as active as possible. So while we'll provide this rationale to our technicians, we'll do so pretty briefly, as you can see here. So this is really kind of distilled into some really major bullet points, but we're not going to any great depth here because this is not a class in verbal behavior. And again, we want to focus on getting them actively learning and applying these concepts. So we're going to move into some discrimination exercises to help ensure they understand the distinction. And here's another screenshot showing how they can do that. Pretty simple, pretty quick and dirty. Okay, so now we've talked to technicians about verbal behavior, what it is and it isn't, why we approach teaching in the way we do, and we've got the basics to now teach them about our unit of analysis, and more specifically, the verbal operants. We're going to narrow this focus to what technicians have to know, not everything there is to know, not what would be nice for them to know, but what they actually need to know to do their jobs well. So we're going to teach them about only the 4 elementary verbal operants, at least at first. And because the distinctions between verbal operants are determined by their functions, we should emphasize each verbal operant's controlling variables, also called putative variables. In other words, what their antecedents and consequences are. So for each verbal operant, we'll give a brief definition, orient technicians to the different types or topographies of the verbal operant, like tacting items, actions, people, features, functions, classes, categories, etc., if we're focused on the tact. Then really hone in on identifying each verbal operant based on its putative or controlling variables. And here's how we've done this in our verbal behavior ProTech course.
Each of the verbal operants is defined by the antecedents and consequences that influence them. These environmental variables are the distinguishing features and what you can use to identify the verbal operant being emitted. In this lesson, we will focus solely on the specific antecedents and consequences that control the echoic using the antecedent, behavior, consequence, or ABC, contingency model. In an echoic contingency, the antecedent is a vocal verbal stimulus. In other words, someone says something. This evokes a vocal response that matches the prior vocal verbal stimulus. In other words, the learner repeats what was just said. A generalized condition reinforcer is then delivered following the echoic response. In other words, the learner gets something general, like praise or a token, rather than what was specifically mentioned in their response. Let's look at an example of an echoic contingency. You may have noticed that an actual car was not present at the time the teacher delivered their vocal verbal stimulus. To evoke a pure echoic, it is important to ensure that the student's response in this case is controlled by what the teacher says rather than by what the student sees. If the student said what they saw, this could be considered a tact. We will cover tacts as a verbal operant in a later lesson. The behavior or echoic response. In this contingency is the student repeating the word car. This is an identical vocal verbal response to the teacher's vocal verbal stimulus that preceded it. The consequence in this echoic contingency is a generalized conditioned reinforcer. The teacher reinforces the student's echoic response with a simple statement praising his correct talking. You may be asking yourself why the teacher didn't give the student the specific item, a car in this case, as the reinforcer. Because if she did, the student's verbal response car would no longer function as an echoic repeating what he heard, but would now function as a request or command to access a car. We will cover mands as a verbal operant in a later lesson. Now that you are familiar with the echoic contingency, watch the upcoming video and see if you can correctly identify the components of the echoic.
Are you ready to practice some French words with me? Sure. Okay, cool. So the first word is cheval. Can you say it? Cheval.
All right, so after watching these videos, and there's one in each lesson is focused on a separate operant, and these videos are tailored for each of the elementary verbal operants, then learners are asked to apply the concepts by activities such as matching. Here's one example, and here's another. We also zoom out and teach them about the importance of teaching each verbal operant so they can begin to understand the bigger picture and how all of the separate verbal operants work together to build a verbal behavior repertoire. And the sequence is repeated across separate lessons focused on, again, each of those verbal operants separately, which you heard referenced in the video. Additionally, throughout the lessons, after controlling variables are introduced and practice activities are completed, therapists practice discriminating between the verbal operants. You can see some examples of that here. So we've got some examples and non-examples are kind of intermixed. And they also do review, which gradually builds in complexity after each verbal operant is introduced. So this table shows you the final table in the interverbal lesson after each of those elementary verbal operants has already been introduced and they've had some practice around them. And once that's done, it's time to begin teaching our new technicians how to teach the verbal operants. They've now got a solid basis and some conceptual underpinnings, but they still have to practice doing this so that when they get in chair with a client, they can do so as effectively, independently, and accurately as possible. And this assumes that they also understand a little something about teaching methodologies such as discrete trials, naturalistic teaching, and incidental teaching. If we've given our technicians a basis in theory and they understand the controlling variables for each verbal operant, as well as some basics about teaching methodologies, now we can scaffold in some practice that will require them to combine all of these separate bits of knowledge and that will actually approximate teaching. And here's an example of what that can look like.
What's your favorite color?
Blue.
Oh, cool. Thanks for answering me.
So this is only one example of one video for one verbal operant here, but in training, we would ideally do this repeatedly until we see a certain minimum level of proficiency. And we would do that for all the verbal operants until we can get to the point where we can intermix them and still see proficiency. All right, now let's talk about some considerations when planning to train the skills we just talked about. As with all the skills we teach our new technicians, we want to make sure we train with efficiency, meaning they can actually perform the skills learned in training on the job. And with efficiency, meaning we're minimizing time and maximizing results, and that we train with maintenance in mind, meaning that our training sticks, right? So it goes beyond the initial onboarding training. And we have to consider how we are meeting BACB requirements in training. If we look at this table, the most obvious area of overlap with today's focus is content area E, behavior change interventions. However, there are code items in some of these other content areas that have implications for teaching verbal behavior skills, like introduction to ABA, right? We talked about Skinner's analysis. That's different from other approaches, data collection, and graphing and assisting with behavior assessments. Additionally, from the perspective of a new technician, this is a whole lot of brand new stuff to learn in just this area, never mind the other areas they have to learn about. The concepts under the theory and verbal operant sections alone make up a pretty long list, but then we add to that these 3 teaching methodologies, and then we heap on expectations around teaching verbal behavior with integrity, and this can get pretty daunting or overwhelming for technicians pretty quickly. So in training, we've got to really carefully sequence and scaffold instruction, as well as ensure we provide enough practice to our technicians so that we ensure that they get this. So to make sure we cover all the requirements, as well as guarantee that training is effective, efficient, and sticks, training needs to be designed in a way that is standardized and replicable. When expectations are clear, then training performance expectations can be aligned and systems can be created in such a way that they will also support the skills you train beyond the scope of that initial onboarding training. So training should also be approached with an eye to quality. Now, I already showed you this visual earlier on, but we can take a closer look at it now. You can see that we've broken up our lessons on verbal behavior in our ProTech course into 2 parts. We've got part 1 with a learner journey and then part 2 with a learner journey. And within each of these parts, the content is scaffolded to maximize learning, ensure lots of active student responding, and allow our learners to practice everything introduced. And Adam will talk a bit more about what really good training should look like momentarily. And given that this content is likely brand new to our technicians and there's quite a bit of theory involved, it's also worth considering whether creating some additional supportive tools and resources will help your team members maintain their skills after their initial training. So here I've included screenshots of what some of these supports might look like. The first is a workbook that accompanies our Verbal Behavior ProTech course. Adam mentioned this at the top of the call, and it's aimed at helping technicians apply the concepts they're learning to their actual work. So this one is for technicians. The second one is a resource for supervisors, and it's meant as a companion guide to the Technician Activity Workbook. It offers helpful suggestions and a structure for supervisors to use as they teach their technicians to teach verbal behavior skills to clients. And then this third picture is of some resources we co-developed with APBA that's hot off the presses. These are cheat sheets for each of the elementary verbal operants, and each includes a short section on theory as well as practice. And the intent here was to provide practitioners with quick, easy to reference materials that they can take with them to help guide their practice. They could actually print these out and have them beside them on the table or on the floor when they're working with their clients. And just like I did in our webinar last month and in the webinar in February and in the one in January, I would argue that when training is done well, it allows us to avoid or at least minimize a lot of the common challenges our new technicians are likely to encounter in practice once they exit that initial training. Here's an example of just one of those common issues: poor treatment integrity. Now, this is always an issue, but I think it's especially an issue when teaching verbal behavior skills. And if we're not conducting systematic checks on these frequently, we might not catch this issue until we see wonky client responding. What I mean by that is under the wrong controlling variables, right? Stimulus control has gone awry. And this can have a major impact on both client progress and our ability to evaluate the effectiveness of our interventions. Because if we don't train well, and if we don't provide clear, technologically sound procedures for our technicians to follow in teaching, then we can't actually determine if our interventions are having their intended effects. And here you see a flow chart that kind of guides either senior technicians, like what our ProTech courses are aimed at, or supervisors through the steps to determine what the problem is and what to do next. So we also need to have systems that prompt us to conduct treatment integrity checks frequently and then take actionable steps to remediate these issues. And I would argue that this needs to be done before any other change to programming is made. So definitely making sure that you're conducting those treatment integrity checks, using those data to determine, do you have a treatment integrity problem? Is there some other kind of problem? And remediating before you move on to changing programming. And if we can't teach our technicians to implement each of the separate verbal operants with integrity, then we've got no hope of teaching them to transfer stimulus control across putative variables. Or what I mean by that is bringing functionally independent verbal operants under multiple control, as is required in more advanced stages of ABA treatment. That is, if we want to get our clients to speak with understanding and navigate social interactions with some level of competency. But this means that we need to train to accuracy and fluency when we're initially training our technicians. All right, now I'll pass it off to Adam so he can share his expertise on how to actually set up training in a way that prepares new technicians for practice.
All right. Thanks, Danielle. And is that we'll put in the email that APBA resource. I think that's one that you can download if you're an APBA member. So that's pretty exciting to have that. And I think a lot of the things that Danielle talked about are no small points, because when you go out and when we go into clinics and we watch technicians deliver therapy and they believe that they are implementing one type of verbal operant or program and they're actually implementing another because of the wrong controlling variables, you see a lot of that start to happen. And it may actually affect the data collection as well, depending on what something's under one type of control and it's meant to be under another type, and then they're putting data in their data collection platform under the wrong target. So that can also start to happen. So what I want to talk about are a few things related to training. Danielle gave you, even though they are screenshots from our courses that we publish, they are things that you should consider when you're designing your own. If you have an instructor-led training, for example, or you've got an online training that is about verbal behavior, you want to do some of the very same things. You want to provide everyday examples that people can start to get a feel for what is verbal behavior, really focus in on those controlling variables, have people looking at and talking about those, especially as they begin to go and implement them in a teaching arrangement. And so a verbal behavior, I mean, this is true of all of the areas that we've talked about in our past webinars, but specifically verbal behavior, there's a lot of concept instruction that has to occur. There's a lot of discriminations that the technician has to make between those different features of one verbal operant versus another, or one teaching verbal behavior in one teaching arrangement versus another. So I put a quote here from Joe Lang. He has a tutorial, as well as Kent Johnson and Andrew Bulla. they have tutorials on concept instruction. And in concept instruction, what you're trying to do is you're trying to teach learners or trainees to respond to certain features about a set of examples or non-examples. And so in concept instruction, there are ways of doing this. I'll show you a screenshot from that article from Lang. He does a concept analysis of a chair. What is and is not a chair? And there are two ways to kind of think about using concept instruction. One is the benefits of concept instruction in working with learners, that when we are doing multiple exemplar training of verbal operant, a particular target for a given operant, that we are exposing the learner to a variety of stimuli that would be considered as part of that concept class. So there's benefit of exploring concept instruction, and these are two articles that are pretty good. I've seen people use these with their BCBAs to talk about how they set up stimulus sets in multiple exemplar training. And so concept instruction is relevant there so that you are teaching verbal operants under the control of different stimuli within that class. But it's also important for training technicians, that they learn concepts related to each of those verbal operants, that they learn what are the critical features of each concept of each operant, so that they don't think that a mand only looks like a mand when it is this one thing, when the learner uses their voice to say it, or when I'm holding up an item and I'm saying, what do you want? Or I'm presenting choices. Those are some of the misconceptions trainees can walk out of training with based on the number of exemplars we provide them with and the number of practices they're exposed to. So you want to make sure that is, that you do consider this as part of upfront training and as they progress. One of the things we've seen is that sometimes people, technician will get assigned one or two cases. They really begin to understand that learner's set of programs, and they understand how that learner is going to respond to that set of programs. And so because of that, they're getting such limited exposure to the number of exemplars that fall into each of these verbal operants as a class, is that they begin to think that verbal behavior is a thing that it is not, or they think that is restricted and is not. You see that when people get confused between an SD that someone sets up the formation of that for a tact versus when they're setting up an SD for an intraverbal. Those kinds of things can start to happen just because we program it right in the data collection platform, or we program it right into the program notes, rather than teaching this more generalizable skill to technicians. So you want to, concept instruction and the principles behind it are effective to address that issue, and to make sure that people are, of course, arranging and delivering the right kinds of variables so that they are invoking these operants. And you can do that through concept instruction. And both of those tutorials kind of describe the principles behind it. It also improves clinical decision-making and their ability to contribute to the clinical team. So this first tutorial, we'll send this in the follow-up, is from Joe Lang. It's a good introduction to concept analysis. He gives you some different concepts. And then this one is somewhat of an extension from Johnson and Bulla, and they give additional examples. And in each one, they'll show you how to do a concept analysis, how to look at the critical and variable features for a concept, and then how do you arrange those in teaching. And I didn't put a link or a screenshot of it in here, but we'll also link to an article that Janet Twyman and I wrote that was on what you do with that set of exemplars when you are sequencing instruction. So it kind of walks you through both the analysis phase and the instructional design phase of sequencing. And again, these ideas are applicable to both developing instruction for learners and also developing instruction for trainees. Okay, so think about concept instruction and how much of you're doing it in your own training. The second one of training tactics that I like across the board, but I think is highly relevant in this area, are verbal checkouts. And this is an idea that's inspired by Michael Fabrizio and Allison Moores Lipshin did this and continued to do it in their organization. And then I think it was spurred by some of the early work from Doug Greer in the CABIS model. And then it was also implemented in Vicky Tucci's competent learner model. But essentially what they would do as part of a training protocol for staff is that once staff were trained in a given set of procedures, or they were, trained in verbal behavior and teaching procedures, and now you've got this client program in front of you, they would have them engage in this verbal checkout, and they had different names for it. I think Michael and Allie called it instructional task knowledge assessment. And so essentially, they would have them look at a client's program and be able to answer certain questions about the instructional task or about the given program. And it was a good way to evaluate the trainee's familiarity with the program, but also the underlying principles. And so this is one example. If I were to have a learner, if I were going to give them, I was going to say, okay, you're working with Ethan. Ethan's got this intraverbal program here. And now what I want you to do is, so that I can ensure that that I'm feeling confident that you can go out there and teach this this program to Ethan, I'm going to ask you certain questions, or you're going to be able to answer these questions about all of the programs that you're teaching. And so what they would do is they would set a timer, and they would have the trainee be able to answer all of these questions, and they would repeat this task until they were able to answer all of them within the given time limit. And so it might look like, if I've got a program description of this intraverbal program, then I would be saying aloud to maybe a peer mentor or an advanced technician or my supervisor. I'd be going through the questions. Okay, so what verbal operant is this? Intraverbal. How do I know that? I'd find where the information is in the program. Next question. How's it going to help this learner in everyday situations? Well, if they've got they've got an established intraverbal repertoire, it can help them answer questions and participate in conversations. Okay, great. What's the SD? I'm hunting and pecking in the program description to find it. Okay, I'm going to say, what do you eat, as one example. And I continue forward, looking at the consequence. What's the learner's response? What would constitute an error for this particular learner? And what can be helpful about this kind of verbal checkout protocol is that it's something that you can do in a supervision meeting. You can have a set of questions. You can apply it across a range of programs and a range of learners, because the answer of what constitutes a correct and incorrect response for Ethan might be different from Sophia, based off of communication modality or whatever the response expectations are. The prompting strategy might be different. How we know whether it's mastered, how many different settings are we going to test it in, may be different based off of the protocol. So I love this approach. It's something that you can also do. I've seen people do it in like a group supervision meeting or in a morning meeting, where they're going to go through this series of questions, and they're going to have technicians pair up with one another. So they're going to go through and have them do a verbal checkout on the program before they go in and actually implement it. And this is an ongoing practice you can use. Last month or the month before, we talked about the tactic called teach back. And we showed you the example from the Andressa Slyman et al. Article of how they use teach back in teaching preference assessments. And so it's very similar. There's some very similar components to it. What I've also seen is we're talking about it here, obviously, with verbal behavior, but people have taken this same approach and have tailored their verbal checkout or their verbal checkout assessment to different areas of treatment. So they have one that's more about skill acquisition programs. They've got one about maybe a behavior reduction protocol, one about a safety protocol, and so forth. All right, the third one is around the idea of themes, or setting up the therapeutic environment so that technicians don't have to work so hard. A lot of technicians, you go into a clinic or you go into a home, and it's such a sanitized environment that they have to work really hard. And no matter how well you teach verbal behavior, you look at them and say, of the 3 objects that are sitting out in this space, what am I going to use to run all these programs? There isn't a whole lot, and it puts a lot of weight on the technician to be creative and thinking about, oh my gosh, how am I going to use these animals to do a coax and tax? And how am I going to, create a play scenario? So one of the things that is recommended by, a lot of folks in this area is setting up themes that then you can wrap content around. Okay. So you're giving, the verbal behavior is sort of contentless. It is agnostic to content. And now you're going to give it content to be wrapped around. And so adding in some meaningful themes, whether it's for a week or a month, and then refreshing, the items and the activities in that environment are one of the ways that you can make it a little bit easier on technicians to be implementing these kind of programs. You still bring in and adapt to the learner's programs, the learner's stimuli. You don't, just abandon all of that, but you find ways to wrap all of it into things. So I'm going to show you some examples. There's a great blog from the autismhelper.com on thematic themes, and they provided several examples of just different materials that were created around topics. So for example, if the topic was schools, they've got different worksheets that are available, or coloring sheets where you can already see different kinds of targets that you can embed into these. They've already got different kinds of activities set up, books that have accompanying stimuli with them. They've got a craft activity. So a lot of the things that you can do early in once you establish those foundation skills in verbal behavior that Danielle talked about, is start bringing in these kinds of activities so that staff can think about, oh, well, how am I going to take these programs and adapt them to these themes? Here's another one that they gave an example of: community helpers. And there's some of these kits that you can buy online. I know file folder activities. Speech pathologists are great at this. They've got like thematic units figured out. And they've got cards that go along with it. They've got bingo, they've got puzzles, they've got the accompanying icons. This is a great way. There's a new kind of AAC speech generating app that I've seen recently that I'm going to blank on the name of it at the moment, but I am going to put it in the follow-up materials. It's Glint, I think. And I actually met and got to see a demo of it. It's really cool. And it uses AI to help generate sort of on-demand visual displays, either for instructional activities or to use as a speech generating device. So it actually lets you to say, you could go in and say, this week we're doing a school, the theme is community helpers. You put in the different characters, you put in the different components of the theme, and then it generates, you can give it the parameters, a 3x3 array of these icons, and it already sets it up, or it sets up the materials so you can cut them out and print them and all that kind of stuff. So there are some different resources that can make it easier on the people who have to generate these materials, and then in turn make it easier on technicians who have to implement this kind of programming. Related to thematic units are verbal behavior webs, or skill broader than verbal behavior, just skill webs, looking at how do I arrange a set of targets around a given theme. And this, I used to work with Kristen Trulick and Catherine Johnson, who were at Learn Behavioral, and they were really big on webs. And it was such a great activity that we were able to embed within technician training and as an ongoing practice. So essentially what would happen in a web is we would give the trainees or the technicians, here's what you've got. Here are the stimuli you've got in this set. You've got this little farm sensory bin. It's got all these different items in it. It's got toy animals. It's got hay. It's got scoops. It's got rice. It's got tractors, all of these things. Now what we're going to do is apply those verbal behavior skills for your specific learner. Think about where could we see it fitting around all of these different domains. Okay. And they would build a web off of that, or we would provide them, earlier technicians, inside the play tub or inside of the materials, there would be a web already created with some ideas around it. Then they'd have to tailor it to their learner, of course. Think about the programming, but you're already decreasing some of the response effort to implement some of these things. Okay. And so related to, once you've got themes in place and you're starting to implement some of the BB program, one of the other things that you may have to train alongside this are play skills. It is not uncommon for people to come into this profession either never having worked with children or not having worked with children in a way that is playful, and then it makes it easy for them to start embedding teaching inside of that. And of course, as all of us know, play is a really great opportunity to embed verbal behavior. It helps communication become more functional. It allows for us to do more generalization work, to build flexible language, and embed lots of different programs in one play routine or scenario. And so I'm going to show you a couple of exercises that I've used before that I find very helpful with new staff who feel uncomfortable playing. And play is one of those things because they're having to generate so many novel ideas around a given set of stimuli and then also relate it to their learner that it can be very difficult to teach this in vivo. What I mean is it can be very difficult to say, you know what, you're going to play with Ethan. We're going to set this up. Here are the 3 programs you're going to run. Now go at it. And then just expect that play skills are going to emerge. Okay. Um, I think that most of the time they don't. There are people who already have this repertoire established. Maybe they have children of their own. They've played with their cousins, those kinds of things. So they have experience doing this. And then other people who sound like they've never interacted with a child before in their life. Okay. And so these are 3 exercises that I think could be very helpful. One is what we call CSAY playful statements in fun voices. And this is, you can spend some actual training time doing this or triaging. You've got someone who's not a very good player, then you can, boom, we're going to do this on the spot. And essentially what you do, and this will take some modeling, but you do timed practice. You give them a set of stimuli, and then they are going to look at those stimuli and they're going to generate playful statements in a fun voice. Like, oh, wow, the cow's hungry. And you're looking for inflection in their voice. Or look, ooh, the barn's opening. So now they're adding sounds in there. Where should the cow go? We're starting to add questions. The pig is dirty. Oh, look at this. And I point out features on the pig. Okay. And so what you would do in the exercise is you might do modeling, showing them how they would do this or how you would do it with the given set. Then you might go back to take a 3-step approach. Then the second step would be volleying back and forth. So I'm going to give a statement, and now Danielle, my trainee, is going to give a statement. Now I'm going to model another one. Now trainee's going to do one, or potentially Danielle's got the right statement. It's just not in a very fun voice. I think she could be a lot more fun with this. Okay. And so I might model the statement again in a fun voice. Now she's just going to repeat it back, and we're going to kind of volley back and forth until we're fading to now she's doing 2 and I'm doing 1 and now she's doing 3, until we get to, okay, now she's able to continuously for a minute generate fun statements with these items. And then I'm going to test, can she do it now with the kitchen set? And can she do it with this other play set? Or can she do it with these themes that we've set up? Those types of things. So that can be a helpful exercise. Now, let's say you've got trainees and that modeling just is not working. You might be fun, but you're not fun enough in the really fun direction to be a good enough model that they can kind of bring it back to the middle. Okay. So one of the things that has been very helpful, I found, is that you can look up online, and there are many of these on YouTube, and then you can also find them on Spotify, or you can get them on different sites that sell audiobooks, is to look for narrated recordings of children's books where the narrators are really playful and fun. And they basically do an echoic exercise where they've got the book in front of them and they're listening to the recording, and then they're pausing and they're trying to imitate the voice of the author or of the narrator. And what's fun about that is that usually those recordings have other sound effects or music in there, and that can be a helpful transition. And so you can do this by having them. The one time I ran a training where we had trainees every day. They would go home and they would practice one of these as homework, and they would come back and they would demonstrate it for the class. And it was a good way to also, establish some rapport as a group if you're training in groups as a trainer, because they were all things that people could technically do well. They had to go home. They got opportunity to practice it was pretty low stakes. Now they're coming back. They're going to perform it for the class. And now we're going to go to a new book. Okay. And they're starting to develop some of these skills with the way that they're making playful statements. They're using fun voices. They're starting to look at things in creative ways, books that would get them to think about objects or animals in creative ways. And now they're preparing kind of a prerequisite step to now being able to go into a novel teaching situation and actually free say or generate ideas of how they could use that particular activity related to a set of targets. So again, you can do this as part of initial training. The training I designed, we would start every training session with 15 minutes of play. And we would use one or more of these exercises at the beginning or throughout it. They became great icebreakers, okay? Rather than everybody go around and, say their favorite color or, say one thing that would surprise you about them. You can actually do this, which is very functional, okay? It can still break the ice, but it can do it in a functional way that will be useful when they start delivering therapy. So this is the last idea, which is sort of a release from those previous 2. free say ideas on the targets. Now, one way you can do this is give people a web, one of those skill webs, and have them look at that and the stimuli in front of them and have them generate ideas. Or when you're more advanced, or you've got let's say a fictional client profile or a real client profile, have them look at the profile that has the targets, look at the stimulus set in front of them, and then have them generate ideas like, okay, well, I could have the learner man for animals or some of the barn pieces or the tractor. I could teach them open with the door. I could have them tack animals or colors or sounds. I could run a listener responding program like give me the pig or put the horse in the barn. I could embed some intraverbals like what says oink. I could have them do some motor imitation like, this. I could have them put together 2-word phrases or 3-word phrases. I could ask them WH questions. It's endless the things that you can do and have them practice around it. But you can have them give that web as a prompt or give them the programs as a prompt, and now they're able to look at the set of the materials they have available to them and generate some ideas off of it. Okay, so play is highly related to verbal behavior because of the context in which, in a lot of the settings that many of you are probably working in, the settings in which you are implementing verbal behavior instruction. The other thing is I gave 3 sort of more childlike examples. You can do the very same thing if you're working with older learners. Okay, you would just replace that fun statements and ideas in a way that's going to be relevant to those stimuli. Or maybe you've got someone who has experience on the CSAE playful statements. You've got someone that has a history of working with young children, and now they're working with teenagers. And you notice that they're not actually, they're talking to a teenager in the same way they would talk to a child. Okay. And so actually what you need to do is you need to do some CSAE practice around having them, or maybe they need to do you need to do hearsay practice where you're modeling it for them around how they can make statements or make comments or ask questions in a way that is not in a fun childlike voice. Okay, so those are some ideas of things that you can do both sort of upfront when you are starting training and as part of the, in addition to the foundational verbal behavior skills that Danielle talked about, in addition to the teaching skills that we didn't really go into today, but those specific teaching procedures that you would use. This is sort of that third element, both some things to think about in designing the training, but also in actually making the environment one that's more hospitable to doing verbal behavior instruction. So thank you for spending the last bit of time with us. We hope that you found some ideas that are helpful to you. As a major takeaway, we hope that you'll check out the Clinical Leaders community. There will be a link to it in our follow-up email. Again, we would love to have you and your team as part of the community. And feel free to contact us about any of the solutions today. I think more than any of our previous webinars, you got to see a good sneak peek into one of our ProTech courses. So if you think it's something that you and your team might use, we would love to chat with you about that, as well as all of our other product lines for RBTs and BCBAs. Or if you're looking to engage in a deeper level about your clinical and training systems, maybe a performance improvement, addressing some issues related to turnover or quality or operations, we'd love to chat with you about that. And we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar or any of our other live events. So thanks for being here, everybody.